to this episode of Grimerica Goes Deep, Ancient Mysteries and Lost Civilizations. This is Chapter 3, Giants and Bloodlines with Gary Wayne. Thanks for joining us, Gary.
Well, thank you for inviting me back, and so happy to be with you today, and really looking forward to the topic and the conversation. This has the ability to go in 1,000 different ways, and all of it will be very interesting, I think.
Yeah, this will be great. I mean, we had you on our other show, and we kind of focused more on secret societies and all that, but your book, your tome that you have, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, I mean, you touch all these different things, so I thought for this series, you know, it would be good to focus on the giants and the bloodlines. Even my own acceptance of this is changing as we go here. I'm starting to open up to more of the possibility of giants and these bloodlines. I mean, it's one of those things that it's taken me kind of years to get there, but your work has helped me kind of arrive to this. So
I totally understand that. You know, when I was doing research for Bible prophecy and I wanted to catalog everything, and, you know, you get into Genesis 6 and you get this thing about giants popping up, I just kind of go, you know what? I really don't want to deal with that. And then kind of keep moving on, right? And so it takes a while to sort of, you know, kind of come to grips with saying, okay, well, it said that. What else does it say about it? And my approach on the whole understanding of giants is to not stay with the superficial sort of platitude for people. You can get that almost anywhere, but I tend to like to back it up with a lot more solid information and deeper information so that people get a better sort of feeling for the veracity of this is something that needs to be understood.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what was I going to say about that? So before we were on secret societies and all that, and then the giants seem to fit in with this sort of on multiple different levels. I mean, I think you were kind of when we left that show last time, you were kind of seemed like you were moving towards more research in giants, and you were going to do some conferences and all that. So I thought maybe you could update us on some of the contemporary research, or maybe stuff that necessarily might not be in your book either.
Yeah, so obviously conferences that were planned are kind of off the books again for this year, but I am writing a second book, and for people who've been following me, it's not the one that I've got about 200 or 300 pages into. It's another one that I've decided to do because there's just so much interest in the giants, and so I'm doing a sequel to the Genesis 6 and adding significantly more amount of information just sort of around that topic, and then how that sort of funnels into the bloodlines and into the end time. And not that there isn't a ton of information in the first book, but there's just so much information out there that I want to kind of get that into people's hands. And because once people kind of get the bug for this is something, you know, I think I want to learn about, they can't get enough information. And so the trick is can you move it beyond the sort of the standard information that's out there, and then go in ways that people haven't thought of, but not in a theorizing sort of perspective, but linking it up not only biblically, but with other cultures and with historical records.
Are you finding contemporary research and people, because there is a lot of stories, and there's been some books that researchers that are just focusing on giants and the whole double rows of teeth and the red-haired giants and the graves and the mounds and all these old pictures of people with skeletons. Like, are you finding that that's actually helping corroborate your?
Oh, absolutely. And anytime there's more discoveries of that and more understanding about whether or not it's the serpent mounds or not just the red-haired skulls that say out of Peru or North America that they found, but I expect that they're going to find blonde-haired ones as well, because there's two different sort of aspects to that. So what a lot of people don't understand is that if you go into Atlantean mythology, for example, which is backed up by Egyptian history and mythology as well in terms of what those giants look like, And of course, the first question gets to be is, well, I didn't know there was giants in the Atlantis story. Backing that up just a half a step for people so I don't get ahead of them. Poseidon had a consort or a wife named Clymene. Of course, he had many wives as well, but in this particular family that he starts, he creates 10 demigod kings. And demigod, in its ancient understanding, is the offspring of a god and a human female. Just like the Genesis 6 story has the sons of God and the daughters of Cain, producing the Nephilim, or the giants, as it's recorded in the King James Version Bible, with giants going back to the word Nephil, and I am for the male plural. So these demigod kings were described as Atlanteans who had blonde hair and blue eyes and sharp aquiline or hooked noses. They had high cheekbones, their eyes glowed, they had long necks, they were serpentine looking because they looked just like the Watchers who created them. And as they come across in the Tuatha De Danann as being those who escape in a polytheist and secular sort of accounting of this, secular is probably not the right word, but a secular would cover mythology, let's say out of Greek mythology. They escape out of Tartarus, and there's two kinds of the Tuatha De Danann. The Tuatha, the tribe of Anu, which is the parent god in the Sumerian pantheon, and Diana, which is the god of the fairies out of the Roman pantheon, and typically more the goddess that's associated with the Tuatha De Danann. Well, they have two different versions of the survivors that escape out of the Tartarus, which is the abyss prison, because of the rebellion of the gods as recorded all around the world. So they have a red hair, hazel-eyed version that migrate more up to out of the Middle East to, first from Scythia, where they escaped from, down into the Middle East, into Sumeria, and then over into Ireland and England, and starting that sort of mythology. But the blonde hair, blue-eyed ones went straight up the Danube, which the Danube is likely named after the Tuatha De Danann, into Transylvania, into Romania, into Russia, into Germany, into the Norse countries. So you've got these two different versions and skin colors that are backed up by Egyptian and Greek history and mythology that is saying that, there might be some blonde-haired ones that are also going to be discovered, just as the Aryans are the same people, and it's the same mythology. So the Nazis took that back to Thule, which is an Atlantean equivalent, or talking about Atlantis, just with a different name. And so that's where their new man or Nephilim ideology comes from, that they were trying to recreate through the blood or the Vril. So I know we went down a bit of a rabbit hole there, but again, just to show people that this is a global historical reckoning of what happened in prehistory that always includes giants. And we just need to understand that fact.
How do we know the difference between the blonde-haired giants and the red-haired giants? Is there actually still hair on the skulls, or is it just from the folklore?
Well, in the descendants, which I would say the ones that they're finding the hair on, so particularly in North America with the skulls that were found by the Native Americans, and the more later discoveries down in Peru, they would be of a more recent nature. So they would be people that were dying somewhere between about 0 to about 1000 AD, and they still had traces of that red hair. So I would expect then you would find similar sort of descendants of the blonde-haired ones that would be in that sort of range. But they also come with those elongated skulls, right? And what people don't understand about those elongated skulls is that you can bind heads to emulate these demigods. But what you can't do is increase the volume with the binding. So these things are monstrous, significantly bigger, and these skulls don't have sutures that the human skulls have. So these are completely different from a larger type of being. And we're not talking about 8 foot, although you'll find as the bloodlines sort of descend down, and in the North American discoveries of giants and the newspaper articles that run from 1850 right up into the 1950s, and there's a huge database on that. They can run anywhere from 7 feet to 18 feet. Some accounts in Mexico is 30 feet, but not quite as reliable on that kind of reporting from those newspapers. So these things were significantly bigger. So if you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, again, I understand that's a myth, but you have these Ugaritic writings that are not located in Sumer, but they're talking about the same epic as the Epic of Gilgamesh, but talking about him with his dimension. He is 11 cubits. And a cubit can either be 18 inches or 21 inches. And so that'll put him 16.25 feet to 19.5 feet. And that's a monster. And he is 4 cubits wide. So that's 6 to 7 feet wide. And that's why they're thought not only to have those serpentine features, and were also quite hairy and their eyes glowed and had these bellowing voices. They weren't just these sort of sideshow freaks in a circus. These were powerful, muscular warriors designed for battle. And they would be more equivalent, and this would be underestimating it when we're talking about Gilgamesh being 6 to 7 feet wide. They were thought to be having a height to width ratio that was 2 to 1 versus a human's 3 to 1.
Right.
So these things were muscular. And in Isaiah 25, it talks about these terrible ones, just as King Ababa of the cedar forest is the terrible one who is put in place to do terrible things to humankind. And Enkidu actually kills King Ababa in the Epic of Gilgamesh series as Gilgamesh travels there with them. But where I'm going with this is that the book of Isaiah talks about these terrible ones, these Rephaim, as it's talked about in Ezekiel 31 and 32. And in Isaiah 25, these terrible ones are very, very strong and mighty. And strong goes back to a Hebrew word that's for az, and azaz, as in fortresses and sort of that military aspect. But it also has one word that says stout. Stout is in strong, and that's a description of these giants as being that powerful kind of being. And so even as you get down to the time of Goliath, as he's told in the Bible as having 6 cubits for a height and a span, that's going to make him 9 feet 9 to 11 feet 3 inches on that sort of scale, 18 or 21 inches. So these just weren't taller beings. Now, there are people that are confused with the giants that are more hybrid giants and humans that would be just known as taller. That's a whole different discussion in terms of that height. So not as tall as the giants, but way taller than humans still. And so Amorites might be one of those people that people would refer to as those hybrid humans.
Right. Wow, that's fascinating. You mentioned, so I got a couple questions kind of post and pre-antediluvian giants, and then when you mentioned that they came out of the abyss, the red hair and maybe the blonde hair as well, 2 different lines, I guess. Is that an analogy of the after the flood, the post-diluvian giants?
Well, you get sort of an accounting of these giants showing up after the flood all around the world again, and there's a different accounting of that. And one of those is the Greek mythology that lines up with escaping out of the abyss.
Right.
But if you go now to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you go to the flood story, and just backing up that, Gilgamesh is described as 1/3 human and 2/3 god, as is Enkidu. And Hababa was sort of more of a chimera type of giant of who knows what percentages of what things went into him. And that was at Mount Hermon, the cedar forest, where the Amorites are described as tall as the cedars, which is describing these giant cedar trees as they were the giant tree used for building. You have the flood story also intertwined in there. So Gilgamesh and Enkidu are created after the flood by the gods. So a second incursion, a second violation is what Genesis 6 or the Poseidon story talks about. But in the flood story, Utnapishtim, he's an archetypical Nephilim from before the flood. And he's the Sumerian Noah, so to speak. He is also taking his complete family with him. So you get two stories in there, one of a second creation with Enkidu and Gilgamesh, and then a survival story on an ark with the giants. And so again, all around the world, you have sort of different versions as to how these giants kind of survive or are recreated, but they're kind of directionally the same.
From a biblical perspective, and I don't know if this is in Enoch or not, I've been starting to listen to the Book of Enoch again, which I'm finally starting to grasp. It took a few times. But was the flood created to get rid of the giants?
Oh, absolutely it was. And in the Book of Enoch, it actually sort of co-adjudicates the problems with the antediluvian world from the fallen angels providing the illicit knowledge from heaven and the creation of the giants who sort of turn evil and do all sorts of things. And that parades people into the flood. So if you go into Genesis 6 now, 6:1 through 4 is where the giants are created before the flood. That's the preamble to the flood story. So what happens in Genesis 6, you get the creation of the giants, and you get the Noah's commission because of what the giants are doing, and then you get the flood, all in chapter 6, and then 7 and 8 are going to, and 9 are going to cover the flood, and shortly thereafter. So it is the start of the flood story. There's nothing to separate it, and in all accounts around the world, it's the giants that are causing the gods in the polytheist perspective to destroy the earth because of the destruction and the horrible things that the giants are doing. So everywhere around the world, the giants are connected to this great flood story. And people say, well, okay, well, how do we know the flood story was actually real? Well, you have a recollection that's in all continents all around the world in over 500 cultures and in all sorts of different versions that describe both giants and humans surviving the flood. And I would look to the Book of Enoch and to those other versions and to the Book of Job and into Isaiah and into the Book of Psalms to say this is talking about the same event, more than a flood. It's a cataclysm of events. Volcanoes, earthquakes, all sorts of destruction and upheaval that come along with the flood that now turns everything sort of upside down. So if you're just looking for this sort of sedimentary constant around the world, you're not going to do that because you got things that are turned upside down. And that kind of explains why you have so many of these antediluvian cities that are underwater that secular history can't account for.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We've been doing as part of this series, and part of the other stuff we've talked about is the ancient advanced technology that's being used, and they're still uncovering a lot of this stuff, like in Serapeum in Egypt, and whether it's Göbekli Tepe or Baalbek. I mean, and part of me wonders if these ancient peoples in, let's say, 3,000 to 5,000 years ago didn't see all these things and think, well, the giants must have created this. But then I feel like this is all over the world. There's these massive megalithic structures that could have been made before the flood. I mean, maybe by giants. I mean, is there parts that, in the mythologies that kind of match what we're seeing, like archaeologically?
Oh, yes. So the first king just around the flood era that's mentioned in the Egyptian historical records is a King Narmer or a King Menes or Pharaoh Narmer or Menes. And in that stela, it actually shows the 52-degree slope, if I've got that slope right from my memory, in the background on the Narmer tablet or stela, however they want to call it. And that's dated to about 3000 BC on secular chronology, and which is before the flood, no matter which chronology, biblical or secular that you're using. And even if somebody says, well, maybe the flood was just a little bit before, that's irrelevant because the secular history is that Khephren and and another pharaoh, I think it's Khafra and, I can't come up with the name right now.
Corfu? No, it wouldn't be him, would it?
Khufu?
Yeah, Khufu, yeah.
Yeah, renovated or built the temple, or the pyramid, and I think they renovated it because you've got an Egyptian stela that shows that period, that pyramid, almost 500 years or so previous to that. And anybody who's done, well, not anybody, but a lot of people have done studies on it saying, hey, these buildings are significantly older than what secular history are telling us, and nobody can account for how they built them.
Yeah, we
just
did a show about how they can't account for how those things were built, or for some of and not even just for how big or the big things are built, but the small things like the vases and the intricacy of some of those things, how they're paper thin and semi-translucent. And
yeah, there's a technology there that's being used that we don't have the ability to do today. We can't get to that accuracy. And to see all of the sacred geometry and the astrological alignments associated with pyramids and all of the different megaliths around the world we just can't do it. We can't do something like Machu Picchu up in the mountains today and do the masonry to that degree. I mean, this is something that secular science does a really good job of just ignoring what they don't want to deal with. It's like having all of those, what they call ooparts, those out of place artifacts that are, accumulating like crazy, but they never put them into the secular accounting and timelines because it just throws everything right out the window. They can't acknowledge it, which is really silly because they should be adapting all of the time, but they would have to do so many adaptations and show how many times they've been wrong. It would probably totally discredit them.
Or all these different instances of where you can clearly see building on top of ancient building, where you can see where you know they've just started putting small stuff on top of big stuff, or shitty stuff on top of nice stuff. And
yeah, which is kind of what you're saying about Khufu and Khafra renovating the pyramid.
Yeah. These sites have had an ancient importance right from the beginning, whether or not they're on ley lines or they're on temples out of other temples built above, cities being built upon the same cities. They were put there for a reason and were continued to be honored. And again, no one from a secular perspective is dealing with why does that happen? How does it happen so often? And have you heard about the things about odds and permutations of hitting mathematical zero when you start to consider these things, as being coincidence?
Yeah.
Does it seem to be like a double-edged attack? Because, I mean, we've got just to take, say, North America, for example, there seems to be a ton of evidence of the Smithsonian, burying a bunch of pictures or coming and taking the evidence and disappearing with it. And then we've also got, it seems like, the Vatican keeping a lot of those same sort of secrets. So, like, are those two sort of in alignment at the same time as the Vatican? How do those things dance together when they seem to be so diametrically opposed?
Yeah, you would think that shouldn't be the case. I think both are controlling the information for their own power reasons. And those are the two biggest sources, not the Smithsonian. That's a branch of the Royal Society and the Freemasons. Understand the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians established the Royal Society, and then the money, James Smithson, who was a Rosicrucian and a Royal Society member, funded the Smithsonian to be created with his will. And so all of that is sort of giving you that direct linkage of why that information gets hid. But they're doing it for different reasons. Obviously, there's things in the historical record that the Roman Catholic Church has not wanted to deal with because it would hurt their credibility, or maybe even a lot of the religion that they base their teachings on. And for the polytheists, they're about control in terms of, we don't want to show people that we're the descendants of these monsters and that we created this feudal society, and that we're trying to reassemble that feudal society for the end time and the world government. It's where that you've got a small, powerful elite who they select who's going to be the elite, and the elite was always the larger family of the bloodlines before, who controlled all the literature, who controlled all the education, who controlled the religions, and they want to recreate that again. So it's not in their interest on the polytheist side to tell us who they are until they get this thing reassembled again.
Wow, that kind of leads into the bloodline thing then, which is kind of like, does it go all the way back to Cain and Abel, or can you talk about Cain and Abel in relation to bloodlines and giants, or at least the connection between some of these giants and maybe these secret societies or families? Yeah. Like I never really took, you know, this marriage, these arranged marriages of the rich and the elite, you know, until the last couple of years. I'm thinking, no wonder why they do it, right? They need to keep everything within the bloodlines.
Well, you have to remember that within that cult, and there's two aspects to it: the purity and the proof of the genealogies as to which giant or Nephilim was the patriarch and which angel is key, but also something they call a scion, which in science would be a grafting of a branch on. In the bloodlines, a scion is usually the first son of an inheriting heir of a royal bloodline. It's those ennobled bloodlines being grafted into other marriages. So right from the beginning, you have these giants who usurp all of the kingships both before and after the flood. They're going to intermarry with different branches to keep those bloodlines pure. And they don't want to lose their size. They don't want to lose sort of their control over people. And so when you look at, let's say, Akhenaten and Tutankhamun and in that era, they're still intermarrying with branches out of the Mitanni dynasty, out of Mari area, out of Sumeria. They're always, and they've got multiple wives, right? But they're always of those royal bloodlines from other princes and things, and they're trying to keep that pure. The problem, though, is that you get blood diseases. So you're going to have to enter in some less pure bloodlines to ensure that you're not getting like Habsburg jaw or hemophiliac disease, things like that.
Is that like an inbreeding thing?
Pardon me?
Is that like an inbreeding thing?
Yeah, those are inbreeding blood diseases that they need to continue to sort of refresh that bloodline and the genes that are producing the blood, right? It's all about the genes. So now to get back to your question about, can you connect that back to the Cainite line? Yes and no. And the reason why I say a bit of a no there is you have a flood. So unless people survive the flood, you don't have that sort of direct connection, right? So depending on where you fall, was it a second creation or was there a survival, on how you're going to look at that. So when you go back to what happened before the flood and then what happens after the flood, not only do you have the bloodlines, but you also have the knowledge and you have the religion that somehow crosses and is all united again after the flood. So going back to before the flood, you have the Cainite line, which are going to produce the daughters that are going to intermarry with the fallen angels to produce the giants, to create the demigods. And so that's the bloodline that people would say would show up after the flood in the Bible, who are the Kenites and the Kenizzites. And they're unaccounted for in the Table of Nations. And the Table of Nations, for people aren't aware of it biblically, that's Genesis 10 and 1 Chronicles 1, where you get the 70 nations coming from Noah's descendants to create the nations of the world.
And they're not accounted for in that?
They're not accounted for. Neither are the giants, right? So who are they? And if you take the word, Kenite and Kenizzite back, that links back to the word Cain. In fact, Kenite actually means Cain or smith. Cain was thought to be a smith as well. So you have that is either a surviving bloodline of the Cainite bloodline, or it's a people or giants, because they're not listed in the Table of Nations, that are taking at least that as an accepted name for this tribe after the flood. So depending on how you want to phrase that, and people will say, well, Kenaz is where would be the patriarch for the Kenites and the Kenizzites. Well, that's fine, except that Kenaz arrives way too late, and well before, and right, like 300 years after the flood, you have the Kenites and the Kenizzites being mentioned in Genesis 15, right after the War of Giants, which is another interesting scenario as well. So they predate Kenaz, so they can't be part of that patriarchy that created those Kenites. So where do they come from? And like I say, it's one of two things. They're either accepting a tradition from before the flood, or they're the survivors, and that's for people to believe. And in the Masonic belief system, because they come out of this development of the knowledge before the flood to separate the sciences into the 7 sacred sciences, that develops the sun-worshipping religion for just the elites and the initiations that go along with it, and the secret societies are set up at the same time. And their assessment in terms of how their organization and religion survived the flood is that all of this knowledge is buried under the pyramids in 9 vaults and on 2 pillars made by Lamech or Enoch, depending on which version of the Masonic history of the Polychronicon that you're talking about, has directions to where this knowledge is located. And a fellow by the name of Hermes, who is accepted as Hermes Trismegistus, which is before and after the flood, in the 3 times or the 3 people that are merged together, is one of those Hermes, and he takes that information to Nimrod, who creates Babel. And we might have covered this in the last show. But that's how their religion and organization crosses the flood. And in the Septuagint, Nimrod is not only called a mighty one, which is a Gibberim, which is not necessarily a Nephilim, and he's the son of Cush, so typically that's why you would look biblically at, the Bible says he became a Nephilim, and it doesn't really say how, or not a Nephilim, became a Gibberim or a mighty one. And a human can be a Gibberim, but he can't be Nephilim. And Nephilim can be Gibberim and Nephilim. So just to understand the distinction. But what happens in the Septuagint's version is said that Nimrod made his reputation on fighting and hunting the giants. And so you have these giants that are showing up right after the flood at Babel, which is 100 years after the flood. And so you have that sort of intersection. And then Nimrod, and I think this is where the became part, he stays in Shinar or Sumer after the flood. And he's going to intermarry with these giants. And that's going to sort of start to fuel some of these bloodlines. And that's part of the psioning that goes on. And then in a number of accounts that I talk about in my book, you have the first, not the first pharaoh, but say 2nd or 3rd generation, say 3rd generation would be probably more accurate. You have either his son or his grandson, Nimrod's grandson, taking over the pharaoh kingships in Egypt.
Oh, interesting.
And again, and you've also got giants that are in Egypt as well. They're called the Zuzim. And so that would probably been sort of an ennobling of that bloodline. So a daughter of the Zuzim would marry the patriarch. You need ennobled pure bloodlines to start a new dynasty. And that's why you have a matriarchal line, which is always required for the most purest of the female line. And then, a first son of a very important dynasty would start a brand new dynasty.
So can you speculate on connecting that Cain line to modern elite societies or people? I mean, can you go almost all the way back?
I don't think you can, but I would say that
I wonder how close you can get. I wonder how, if you brought those bloodlines from that time you were just talking about up forward through our current sort of history, I wonder how far you can get, past the Dark Ages or.
Yeah, no, I mean, that flood, unless you ignore the flood, you're not really going to be able to do that. But what I was going to say was that some of the royal families take their bloodlines back to the antediluvian fallen angels, which means they would have genealogies that would take them back to the Nephilim before the flood.
Oh, okay.
Now, whether or not that's accurate or not, I mean, I don't know. I mean, but that's what they say. Those are the genealogies that they have and that they've kept. And what's important is it's not important whether or not we believe it or not. It's important what they believe, yeah, and then what they're doing with that belief system. I would tend to think that we can probably take the bloodlines back to the post-diluvian era and to these different families of giants that show up after the flood.
Right from modern times back to then?
Yeah. Can you give us some examples of that? So if you look at the Windsor family, and this is just on some things that they have said, and also what we know about the dynasty that they're going to connect back to. Prince Charles and Elizabeth, but mostly Prince Charles, had said he has genealogies that takes him back to Vlad the Impaler. Yeah. Right? Which is kind of spooky, but that's a different story. And he was a red-haired, hazel-eyed, pale-skinned, Tuatha De Danann descendant from Scythia that they take their genealogies back to. And actually, specifically to an angel called Chamomile, or Chamomile, as I'm talking about. But so they have those genealogies that they take back to that sort of point in time. And so I would expect, and again, you've got authors, and from the late Lawrence Gardner, if you've never read any of his works, he was a genealogist for a lot of the royal families. And he actually publishes some of these genealogies and takes them back, and at least to before the flood. And then he actually will connect them again into the antediluvian times, kind of just sort of ignoring the flood. Probably because if you just said, okay, let's take it back through Upnapishtim and his family, but not all of them go back to that. But he kind of includes survival stories from around the world and connects those bloodlines in. So if you have, let's say, the Li family out of China, which comes from the Shah dynasty, they would have a set of bloodlines that go back, and they do, and it goes right back to creation with the dragon creators. So again, you have accounts that go around the world, and now whether or not when they run those genealogies and dynasties back, is that before the flood or after the flood? That part's debatable. I'll give you that. But again, they believe their history is older than what secular history says. So they're saying it goes a lot further. So you would have bloodlines in China like the Sing bloodline and the Khan bloodline, or you would have the Ingaroka out of the Incas, and on and on and on and on. They all have the same belief system of their bloodlines and going back to the gods.
Wow, and I mean, they would keep track of this, like not the profane like us. I mean, we can barely go back a couple generations because it doesn't really matter. But I mean, they would probably track this stuff every generation.
They have to be able to prove where they fit in that culture, right?
And like you said, even if it's wrong, it doesn't matter. That's what they're saying, and that's what they believe, and that's what some of their power is based on.
Yeah. And they take the divine right to rule from these genealogies. And that became famous with King James, with his divine right to rule that he asserted that comes from God. What they're saying is that they just don't define who that God is. So the God, when they use it in the singular as that divine right to rule, would be their patriarch angel or their patriarch God of many gods, right? And so that's where their divine right to rule comes from. And again, that goes right back to the core of their belief system and of the giant belief system on they usurped the kingships both before and after the flood, with the divine right of rule as being the God's representative on earth to rule. That's where that divine right to rule comes from. And that's why he has a lion and a unicorn in his coat of arms.
Wow.
Because those are taciturn communication of their genealogies and their history. So if you look at what happens in coat of arms, you're going to get things like eagles, and those eagles tend to be the same replication of an Anunnaki type of bird, right? And particularly when you get a double eagle in there, it's going to go back to the Anunnaki. The lion is going to go back to gods like Nergal or Sekhmet or Mahis, the lion gods. The dragons are going to go back to the seraphim watcher gods. The unicorn is said in the mythos to be part of some sort of angelic being, and is also that mythical horse before the flood that was dancing around and forgot to go to the ark. But in actuality, it was a giant being that had different characteristics of different animals, was white with a red horn, and its horn could kill and gore an elephant with one blow, but it was used for the warrior kings and rulers to ride on into battle. So it's probably some sort of chimera type of animal. And the King James dynasty is the unicorn dynasty. And it's amazing how unicorn now shows up in the Bible, keeping in mind he's the sponsor for the King James Version Bible, and that word doesn't go back to a one-horned horse at all. It's the Hebrew word rem for a wild bull. But yet where it's been implemented is designed to promote his divine right to rule, and is intimately connected in the Bible, where unicorn shows up with, to Mount Hermon, which is where the oath was taken from the fallen angels to create the giants. And again, in second incursion, as I would fall on after the flood. And so Mount Hermon would be that council of the gods that is talked about in Psalms 82, for the 70 nations talked about in Deuteronomy 32, that Satan sits over, and that's the pantheon of gods that runs the world to this day, who those kings still say they get the right to rule from.
So all these different mythologies and cultures have their version of giants, I guess. Like there's the Nephilim and the Anunnaki, the Titans, and all the ones that you mentioned. There's the Chinese ones and the Egyptian ones and the South American ones. I mean, they've all got their version of this.
They do. Yeah. So like you have the Myosi in China, or you have the Datria, the Azuras, and several other names in India. You have the Xibalba in the Kishamaya. All around the world, you have an accounting of these giants, the Tengu in Southeast Asia and into Japan. So there's many, many different names for them. And the Xibalba were and the Tengu, they were a bird-like looking Nephilim and priests, because they usually produced a priest class and a warrior ruling class, and that comes from the Anunnaki, I think, and or a horse type of god, as they're depicted. And what's interesting about the Xibalba that's talked about in the Popol Vuh, which is the holy book of the Kishamaya, is that within the Xibalba branch of these demigods that live in the underworld is a branch of the house of Bat, the Camazotz. So if you Google Camazotz, you'll get this picture of this sort of suit that Batman wears. That's C-A-M-A-Z-O-T-Z. So anytime you're looking at superheroes, you're having a modern reflection of those ancient heroes, aka superheroes, demigods that ruled before. So they're all based on Nephilim characters from prehistory.
Wow.
Superman would be Superman would be classic. Yeah,
Thor, the Norse gods, they're coming back in that way too. So what about the bloodline of the other side, like Abel? Is there a trace, like is there a trace all the way up that on more of a I guess a divine sort of religious aspect?
Right. Okay. Let me cover that off. With Cain, the only way you can say he crossed the flood is that a lot of people, and you saw it in the last Noah movie, has a stowaway on the ark, and that was Tubal-Cain. And that's a belief of mystical Judaism and other beliefs that that's how the Cain line would survive the flood. With Abel, that's cut off right at Cain and Abel. So there's no lineage past Abel, but Seth is born as sort of the replacement when Adam is 130 years old. So that's the Seth line that produces the Noah line and the Enoch, son of Jared, of sort of the holy line. And that's the 8 families, or the 4 males that survive on the ark. And the 4 wives are interesting because we don't know who they are biblically. And so one presumes that that was a selection of all 4 different species, not species, races, and how we get 4 races after the flood. But yeah, we're not told who the wives are.
Huh. And then does that bloodline go all the way from, Seth to Noah, these 4 families? So how can you trace that to Jesus and to or other divine figures?
Well, the Bible does. Yeah. The Bible traces that.
Yeah.
But records coming out of prehistory are not easily found.
No. I mean, you can speculate here. I mean, whether you think it goes like, is there another? I guess what I'm looking for is there another a good side to the to the contemporary world that we have, where that might be fighting against the dark?
Well, I think humans are always fighting against the dark side. But within polytheist religions, it's a dual religion, not only male and female, not only with good and evil fighting in perpetuity, but you also have, within that, you have white magic and black magic. You have, let's say, good Nephilim and bad Nephilim. So an example of that would be Hercules as being a good one, because he's fighting for the good of humankind, but he's still a polytheist. Not that I'm saying people can't have their own belief system, but understand it's part of that same dualism within that. So you have that continual, even within polytheism, of that good versus evil. And all of these, though, tend to be a natural enemy of the monotheists, though.
Right.
Doesn't the monotheism seem to be, like, in a lot of ways, just like evolved from the polytheism? Like, I mean, you see a ton of crossover from the, say, the Catholic holidays or the Christian holidays and some of the old Norse holidays.
Or the pagans, yeah.
Or the pagan holidays.
Yeah, we shouldn't confuse religion with what the Bible talks about. And so when I look at monotheism, I would look at what's taught in the Bible. And that would apply to Judaism, and then Islam would look at what's written in the Quran, not with what the religious aspect teaches and does, because typically it's not always congruent with what the Bible talks about.
So should that
now when you move that back to the start of Christianity, you have a changing of Christianity with Constantinople, where it becomes a state-sponsored religion. And he copies that off of Persia, Constantine does, which had Zoroastrianism, which worked well to unite the empire. So what Constantine does is he takes Mithraism, for the most part, which is the most popular religion of that time, particularly with the army, which would be an important set of people to appease, and he homogenizes that with Christianity. And you see a lot of that coming together, but it's to appeal and unite the empire as opposed to promote pure biblical Christianity. And so you get now things like Sunday being the Sabbath. And the excuse is that is the resurrection day. Okay, fine. But that is also, the day of resurrection and an important day for Mithraism, right? And that's the worshiping of the sun. And you get December 25th, which is going to be taken as the birthday for Christ. That's the birth date of Mithra. So you get a lot of that sort of homogenizing. You get a separation of the crucifixion from the Passover. And now being called Easter, just as you have Easter being talked about in Acts 12:4, which the Greek word is Passover. And it's there to get people to move away from Christianity and to start having them do rituals on those holy days that are really polytheistic. So, yes, you have that mixing and confusing of Christianity with polytheism, but that's because of the religion. And
so should it go?
What I always, and that's one of the reasons why I'm a contrarian.
So should it go all the way back to the Book of Abraham then? Because isn't that where the sort of 3 books branch out from?
Well, yeah, and that's what they're going to attack for the universal religion when we get into the end time. Because if you want to bring monotheism into polytheism, you need to hit that where they all intersect, which is Moses and Abraham.
What's the new religion?
Right? And well, that's the new Babylon.
Scientism?
That is, no, it's the same old polytheist religion that Enoch created that crossed the flood into Babel, where you get that allegory from. So what they'll talk about, and I talk about this in detail in my book for people if they were interested to read about it, is that they say Moses never taught monotheism, that he was raised a polytheist at Heliopolis, which he was, right? But he never converted to monotheism. This is the religion he says he took back to Israel. And that at the time of the monarchy, it goes rogue and creates this monotheism, even though Abraham's a monotheist. Okay, but understand this is where they're going to wedge it. And this is the story that they're talking about coming out with. And so the Essenes are the ones who kept that religion alive. And they take their religion back to Heliopolis and the Therapeutic. And the Essenes were the third sect of Israeli priesthood and actually had priests on the High Council. And they believe in the fallen angels. And they keep the secrets of the angels kept secret even upon death. And they started the monastic movement that became part of the Christian Catholic religion, whether or not it's the Jesuits or whether or not it's the Franciscans. All of that monastic order goes back to the Essenes, which is part of that infiltration that I was talking about. And so the Essenes are the mystical aspect that they say is the pure religion. And it's the Essenes that the secret societies like to link themselves back to. The other aspect of Kabbalism starts in Babylon when the Judeans are in Babylon and they bring back the Kabbalistic sort of ideology. So the Sumerian mystical history and religion marries into Jewish mysticism at that point in time. And that's where the Kabbalist writings come from, or the Targums and things like that that influenced Judaism. So that's where they're going to hit it and say, if Moses was a polytheist and your religion isn't his religion, then come home to the home religion. That's the religion of Babylon and the religion that crossed the flood.
Which is polytheism?
Polytheism, yes.
Which is pagan.
And to the pantheon of gods.
And that's going to be the new, and that's going to be the new, and you're saying that's going to be the new religion for the end times.
Yeah, and they're going to have to do
Is
that
it because
through
of that?
a number of cataclysms and prophets, right? And prophets of disaster. Otherwise, how are you going to get people to come together like that?
Yes,
right? It's just
yes.
not going to happen.
What is the I guess at what purpose? Because if I'm being honest, I can almost feel like a tug back towards paganism. I'm an Indian, so that's probably why I'm closer to paganism than most of the other people at the table.
So the belief system is this, that is they need to have this harmonic convergence so that they can evolve into the next level of humanity, whether it's vibrating, however you want to organize that thought process and how that takes place. And they believe to do that, they have to have one world religion and one world government that's operating as one to make that happen. So again, it all comes down to what they believe, as opposed to what may be true, but that's what they believe. And that's what is called in the New Age as, the age of Aquarius. where you're going to get that harmonic convergence. It's all talking about bringing what they would call the 1,000 points of light together. So that's the famous buzzwords that both Senior and Junior of the Bush family talked about in several speeches, including at Senior's funeral by Junior. And the 1,000 points of light is a reference to the spark of the divine. And the 1,000 points of light was used in the New World Order speech by President Bush Sr. In the 90s when it first sort of came out. And that spark of the divine that they're trying to round up is the gene of Isis that produces the Rh negative bloodline that they want to have for this new age that they're going to bring about. And they envision, just as the Nazis did, this 1,000-year reign, which is, again, the polytheist version of the monotheist millennium.
Wow, that's fascinating. Connecting a lot of that. So I don't know if we should go down the ISIS and Rh negative bloodline thing, but I do want to ask you about
we got about 5 minutes left.
Yeah, the flood. Like, does the Younger Dryas, the flood that happened now? That this basically, I think there's a lot of evidence now showing that
11,600 BC.
Yeah, 11,600 BC. There was
the
massive,
end of it. So 12,600 BC would have been like impact one. It looks like.
But that doesn't really match with the biblical flood, does it, or does it?
No, it doesn't match with the biblical flood. But as Plato talked about in Timaeus and Critias, which is the Atlantean story, that there was more than one flood.
Right.
Now, typically, standard Christian dogma is that the world is 6,000 years old. I think there's a lot of biblical scripture that says otherwise. I'll talk a little bit quickly about this case that's applicable to the flood. So you have the flood that's going to happen about 2400 BC using biblical chronology, 3000 BC, 2950 BC on secular chronology.
So like
and you've got these other floods that are
ago.
happening at 7,000 and 11,000 and other ones. And Plato talks about these floods that come along. So if you look at 2 Peter, where it's talking about the end time and the destruction reserved for fire of the water that was in water and was out of water, which is that chaos separation of the waters talked about in all the creation myths around the world, you have this perishing of the world. But within that, and I won't go into that as that leads into how old the earth might actually be in Genesis 1:1 to 1:2. It was a 2.5-hour lecture I did to sort of cover it. So we'll skip over that part of it. But it has in there, a day is like 1,000 years to God. So now if you overlay that onto the days of creation, and you have the 6 days that are created to renew the earth, and then you have the 7th day, that's 1,000 years, and then the 8th day is another 1,000 years. So you're getting a chronology that's being added on to take you to 13 or 14,000 years, which starts to now shape up and conform with some of those other events that would have been going on.
Well,
and so day six people would have been created at least 2,000, maybe up to 3,000 people, 3,000 years before Adam is created.
Well, that might fit in too well, because I mean we're planning on doing a few seasons. I wouldn't be surprised if we get into religion and spirituality down the road and start dissecting the two, or seeing where they cross and stuff like that. So that might be a good fit for a future season for sure.
Sure.
Yeah, before we let you go, can you back to the giants quickly and the contemporary stuff that you're going to be looking at in your new book?
Yeah.
Like, if people are interested in the modern mystery of giants and the modern evidence, I guess there seems to be. I mean, you've laid out this global conspiracy of giants for sure, but there's the mounds in North America, and there's all this other stuff. Like, what do you think you should point people to for evidence in the modern sense?
Well, there's a link, and if people can't find it, they can get a hold of me. I can send it to you. It's a link where it has old newspaper writings.
Right.
That I was talking about earlier, starting in about the 1850s. Yeah. And again, all of those findings, they go to the universities, and then to the Smithsonian or right to the Smithsonian. They just kind of disappear. I think from a contemporary basis, those are the best ones to look at, and then look into the Peruvian skulls.
Right. What about a lot of the pictures on the internet? I mean, there's a ton of big feet in hard stone. There's a ton of giant bones. I mean, I know some of them are probably faked, but it seems like some of those have to be real too. I mean, there's even a video I saw of like this Chinese giant going through the street, and I don't know if that was faked or not. But...
Yeah, that one's fake. That was out of a movie thing. But,
too bad.
A lot of look for the things in stone, and look for the reliefs where it shows a lot of giants. And what I do when I do a posting, and I'm going to talk about giants, I'm going to show the picture, but in the comments I'm going to put in, this is the stela and the date and where it came from, and this is where it's kept today, so that people know that those giants are, those reliefs are actually legitimate.
Okay.
So you give some sourcing on it. And
okay, good.
It's not hard to Google a picture. You may have to go a couple layers into it, and then you'll start to get back to where the picture came from, and then you can trace that back to the museum.
Okay. Sounds good. Awesome.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Gary. This has been awesome.
Yeah, and can I just touch on a few names out of the Bible that are giants?
Yeah,
absolutely. So this is like the who's who of giants.
I mean, people are familiar with the name Nephilim. I also talk about Rokfin. So Nephilim only shows up 3 times for giant in the King James Version Bible. All the other 25 times it goes back to Rephaim. The Rephaim are the post-diluvian giants. Now, you've got other names that are shown that are giants, which are Anak, or the Anakim. And you've got the Emin, and you've got the Zuzim that I mentioned earlier, the Amalekim, the Horim, the Zamzuzim, the Avim, the Hivim, and the Horim. And there are more yet. You have the Caphtorim, you have the Perazim, I think you have the Kenim and the Kenazim that I mentioned earlier, and you also have the Caphtorites, the Caphtorim as well, and the Chetharim that are mentioned. And that's the main ones that you're going to see talked about in the Bible, but they don't always say they're giants.
And those would be the ones that we're spinning into that become the bloodlines. Those would be dynasties, like each of those ones you mentioned are the dynasties we were talking about earlier.
Yes, but as those empires come together and fall, they get transferred into another one. That's where it gets confusing, right?
Yeah.
But those would be the initial bloodlines.
But that's some good context, because I'm sure people don't realize that all those are for giants, because you'd have to do that research and link everything back to figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you didn't know, let's say in Genesis 14, that Tidal, King of Nations, and Eraphael and Kedorlaomer, and those 4 kings, if you didn't know anything about them, or the etymology to their name and to their religion, you wouldn't know they were giants.
Right.
The Bible must be public domain. We should do a little animated series where we make the giants giants, and we make them doing the stuff we really think they were doing.
Yeah.
Might not be.
And then the other thing that people don't realize is how many hybrid human races were created from the Rephaim. So you've got the whole clan of Canaanites. You've got Canaan, and you've got Heth and Sidon. Those are the only 3 patriarchs that are listed. So the other 9, whether or not it's the Amorites or the Jebusites or the Erudites or any one of them, they do not have a patriarch. They're just listed as families. That's because Rephaim patriarchs aren't listed in the Table of Nations.
Right, right.
So let's say the Amorites is one example. The patriarch for that was a giant and an offspring of a god by the same name of Amar or Amaru, as they're known in the Sumerian pantheon. And they produced the Amorites that were taller and giant-like, but not as tall. And those are the people that lived around King Og and Sihon and in the Middle East. And they're actually the same people that started the Hammurabi dynasty. and you take Hammurabi back, it's got Hamar, MR in there, and Rap, because you can spell it with a B or a P, and the Rap comes from Rephaim. And again, that's always intermixed into those ancient names is the god and part of their bloodline.
Fascinating. That's great.
Yeah, that's great. Before we let you go, Gary, where can our viewers track you down? Where's your website and all that fun stuff? Yeah,
so the best place to get a hold of me is on my website, the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. On that website, I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters, so you can get a good feel for whether or not that's a book for you or not. And if it is, you can order a signed copy from me there, or you can link over and get a Kindle version, or over to Amazon.ca, Amazon.com, and BarnesandNoble.com. So you can get copies through there as well, or through most online bookstores. And if you wanted to support your local bookstore, it's distributed by Bookmasters. So lots of ways to get a hold of the book. And if you want to get a hold of me, I've got to contact the author there, and just click on that. And you can ask for a document on something. I have lots of documents I give out at no charge, or just ask me a question and I'll get back to you. Excellent. And then when do you think the new book will come out? Is that going to be quite a long project? No, I've done most of the research on it already. So I've got it in a lot of the documents that I have. So I'm just taking that off. I'm hoping to have that out by the end of the year. Oh, nice. Okay, good. Yeah, well, keep in touch with us for sure, and we'll plug that when it comes out. And yeah, send me the link to all the newspaper clippings as well, and I'll go through that. I will. Yeah. Yep. Excellent. Thanks, Gary. It's been great.